A June morning. The atmosphere at the construction site buzzed with energy, the roar of drills, the clash of metal and the hurried footsteps of dozens of workers in dust-covered uniforms. But inside a makeshift office container where engineers and managers were urgently meeting about the timeline of a 30-story tower project, all sound seemed to be cut off by a voice cold as steel. "I suggest you stay quiet and let the professionals speak." All eyes turned toward the man who had just been silenced. It was Malcolm Davis, a 40-year-old black man with a solid frame and hands weathered and darkened by 2 decades of trowel work and concrete. He stood there among technical blueprints and timeline charts without a tie or a name badge, only the straightforward presence of someone who had seen foundations collapse over a single overlooked error. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. Just minutes earlier, Malcolm had spoken up calmly but firmly about a severe discrepancy in the foundation load calculations in the site's northeast corner. The current design had completely ignored an area with a hidden slope in the ground. If not corrected, the entire building could eventually sink and settle unevenly over time. Instead of listening, Brian Whitmore, the newly appointed chief engineer, got up, scoffed, and looked around the room. "Seems like this bricklayer can read blueprints. Maybe we should hand him the master's degree from Stanford that took me 6 years to earn." The whole room laughed, some with awkward chuckles, but enough to form a cruel consensus. Only Malcolm didn't laugh. He didn't reply with words. He looked at Brian not with anger, not with fear, not with submission, but with the gaze of a bricklayer who had seen too many crooked walls and knew exactly which would collapse first. A worker in the corner lowered his head and adjusted his hard hat as if trying to disappear from the room. Then Malcolm gently closed his notebook and said slowly, "I just thought I should remind you of that." The room fell into a strange silence. Brian smiled smugly, then returned to continue the meeting, pointing at charts on his tablet. The project was behind schedule. Cost cuts, optimization, everything needed to be handled. No one noticed in one corner of the table, the black bricklayer quietly pulled out an old phone and typed a few lines of text. The first brick had just been laid, not to build a wall, but to break down a system. And it would be the very hands most disregarded that would redraw the blueprint of this entire site. Malcolm walked out of the meeting room as if nothing had happened. The midday wind blew gently across his face, sweeping some of the concrete dust from his collar. His steps were not hurried, but steady. Each seemed to carve a message into the ground. "I don't need to shout to be heard." Behind him in the temporary room, Brian Whitmore continued to ramble on about technical optimizations and management innovations. In his eyes, Malcolm had already been extinguished. A shadow, a background figure, like hundreds of others, a nameless worker silently mixes mortar and hauls steel. Brian didn't know or care that right here on this site he had just raised his voice to humiliate the worst man he could have chosen. And the message Malcolm sent contained only 3 lines. Location confirmed. Emergency meeting in 15 minutes. Don't reveal my name yet. Let them show their true colors first. No emojis, no exclamations, just the cold clarity of someone who understood the power game and had chosen the right moment to flip the board. In the command center, a young manager had just received the system message. His face turned pale as he rushed toward the operations room. Seconds later, Brian's phone rang. He looked at the screen, frowning. The message contained just one line. Emergency meeting with the chairman in 15 minutes. Mr. Thomas Jefferson will be present. The entire room fell silent. That name, the man no one had ever seen, was a living legend within the company. Thomas Jefferson founded Horizon Structures, a renowned tycoon who was fiercely private. No one had seen his face and no photos existed. All anyone knew was this: when he appeared, it was either to grant a historic opportunity or to cut someone down without hesitation. Brian swallowed hard. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar and straightened his tie. "Get everything ready again. I want the site to be spotless." "No sign of any disorder," he barked, trying to force composure. No one noticed a man walking toward the administration area at the far end of the lot. No dusty hard hat, no crumpled work uniform. Malcolm Davis was now wearing a crisp white shirt, neatly pressed trousers, a leather briefcase, and thin-rimmed glasses. The storm had just been named, and it didn't need thunder, just the truth. The steady engine hum of the sleek black Mercedes echoed from the gate of the construction site. All activity suddenly slowed, as if someone had turned off the background music. Workers looked up. Engineers straightened their jackets. Brian stood up straight, gently patting the front of his vest to mask the unease rising beneath his skin. The driver got out first, a man in a black suit with an earpiece, a bodyguard. The back door slowly opened, and from it stepped out a middle-aged black man, dressed in a dark grey suit, blue tie, and unblinking eyes. His face was breathlessly familiar. A few workers held their breath. One stammered, "It can't be. That's—" Brian rushed forward, hand extended, his mouth curving into a rehearsed smile. "Sir, it's a great honor to welcome Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Everything is progressing on schedule. The man did not shake his hand. Instead, he looked Brian straight in the eye, not with the gaze of a bricklayer, but of an owner staring directly at the arrogance that had just dug its grave. "Looks like you're waiting for someone else." Brian froze. Yes, we're expecting Mr. Thomas Jefferson." The man calmly adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, then said each word clearly and sharply, like metal falling on stone. "My name is Thomas Malcolm Davis, owner and founder of Horizon Structures." A thick silence blanketed the space. No one moved. No one breathed. Brian opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again like a fish caught out of water. An engineer standing behind him dropped his pen. No way, he's a bricklayer." "I am a bricklayer," Malcolm replied, his voice low and heavy like machinery grinding to a halt. "And I was standing next to you this morning when you believed I wasn't worthy of being heard." Brian turned pale. His hands began to tremble. He stammered, If I had known." Malcolm gently cut him off, not needing to raise his voice. "And that is the problem." No one said a word. Amid the construction site that had roared with noise that morning, now only the wind rustled through the temporary plywood boards, and the faint clang of metal from distant cranes echoed quiet, as though even the sky was listening. Malcolm stood upright, removed his glasses, and looked around at the familiar faces. The ones who had walked past him without a greeting. The ones who had smirked when he gave suggestions. The ones who stayed silent when he was humiliated. "I understand," he began, not with anger or blame. "Everyone here is wondering, why did I do this? Why would the founder of the company disguise himself as a bricklayer?" No one dared to answer. He took a deep breath, eyes gazing far toward the unfinished tower. 15 years ago, I founded Horizon Structures not just to build skyscrapers. I wanted to build a place where every voice had value, even those speaking through cement-covered gloves. But over time, I saw what I created begin to resemble a miniature version of the world outside. The higher the floors, the lower the humanity. The more degrees, the less listening. He turned to Brian, standing like a plaster statue, ashen and shaking. "So every time I begin a major project, I return to where I started, wearing the worker's uniform with my middle name, Malcolm. No one needs to know who I am. I want to know whether people still know how to respect others when they believe I have no power." A soft cough came from behind. Leonard Brooks, the oldest supervisor on site, had salt and pepper hair and warm eyes. "Mr. Davis," he half smiled, half scolded. "You're springing another surprise inspection again, I see." Malcolm let out a slight chuckle, the first since that morning. "If I had given notice, Leonard, I wouldn't have seen people's true nature." Leonard nodded. His gaze shifted to Brian, not with anger now, but profound disappointment. "I've worked with Malcolm since the days we carried mortar buckets. He always said a building only stands strong when its foundation isn't rotted. The same is true of a company, and the weakest foundation is usually where people think they're the strongest." No one moved. A few workers lowered their heads. A young engineer looked away, eyes rimmed with red, and in that very moment, that silence was no longer denial. It was recognition. They had stayed silent at the wrong time, to the wrong man. Malcolm walked toward the technical meeting room, where he had been dismissed and disrespected in front of many eyes just this morning. But this time, he entered not with cement-dusted gloves, but with a sleek black tablet in hand, and the calm silence of someone who already knew how the story would end. The room was packed. Brian Whitmore sat at the head of the table, trying to sit up straight, though the once proud spine now seemed like a rotted beam, unable to hold him upright. Malcolm opened the tablet and lightly tapped the screen. The recorded audio from the morning meeting began to play sharply and clearly, like metal scraping against stone. We work based on calculations, not the eyes of some bricklayers who don't even know how to use a tape measure properly. The room turned cold, as if someone had just opened the door to a freezer. Brian's face turned bright red, then pale within seconds. He tugged at his tie as if choking on his own words. Malcolm didn't look at Brian. Instead, he looked at the engineering team who had shaken their heads or turned away when he was humiliated. "Our internal monitoring system records all meeting audio," he said, with a calmness more like a lecture in ethics than a reprimand. "And this morning, I submitted a technical alert to the Independent Inspection Board." An inspector stood up holding a folder. "After an urgent review, we discovered 17 serious technical violations in the design and construction of the foundation, including substandard materials, unauthorized substitutions, and critical ignoring of internal safety warnings from on-site staff." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, specifically in the Northeast Foundation, the area I pointed out. A young engineer raised his hand, voice trembling. We warned Mr. Whitmore, but he said cutting the budget was the priority. Any feedback would cause unnecessary delays." Malcolm turned back to the room. "Why cut costs in the most dangerous area?" Another engineer spoke up this time without hiding. "To qualify for end-of-project bonuses. The engineering team would get a share if we saved more than $1 million. Brian shot up from his seat, his face flushed red with rage. "This is a character assassination. I'm a professionally trained engineer. I have a degree from Stanford." Malcolm still did not raise his voice. He leaned slightly forward and asked gently, "From Stanford, or from the prejudice of someone who believes their degree gives them the right to belittle the working hands?" No one answered, because by now the truth had already spoken enough. The meeting room sank into a deep silence, not the silence of awkwardness, but of collective shame. Just 1 minute ago, Brian had been the most powerful person in the room. Now he was just a shadow swallowing his own mistakes. Malcolm stood still, unhurried, his gaze no longer focused solely on Brian, but on everyone. Those who had laughed along stayed silent and turned away when they should have spoken up. "I didn't come here for revenge," Malcolm's voice rang out steady as steel, but not without humanity. "I came to restore something more important than reputation, truth, and ethics in the construction profession." He placed a thick folder on the table in front of Brian. "This is your termination letter, along with the complete documentation of violations, fabrications, and clauses sufficient to file a lawsuit against you for professional negligence and endangering public safety." Brian trembled, his hands clenched. I have the right to defend myself." "And you will," Malcolm replied. "But I'm giving you another option." Malcolm pulled out a second document and placed it next to the first. "If you resign, immediately return all bonus money earned through improper processes, and most importantly agree to volunteer as a free instructor for 6 months at our company's training center for Black youth and individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds." He paused, then concluded, "Then I won't press charges, and your professional license will not be revoked." The room was stunned. A few people began to nod slightly, not because Malcolm struck hard, but because he didn't strike to destroy. He hit to rebuild. Brian whispered, his voice dry as ash. "Teach. Kids who haven't even finished high school." "Exactly," Malcolm replied. "To the people you once believed didn't deserve to be heard. You have 5 minutes to decide. In the meantime, I invite all site workers to the central courtyard. They deserve to know what just happened." The workers gathered in a circle, faces dripping with sweat and eyes filled with uncertainty. They didn't know why they had been summoned. They only knew that the new bricklayer from the other day now stood at the highest platform, with eyes no longer humble but commanding. Malcolm stepped forward slowly and took a deep breath. "Good morning, everyone. To some of you, I'm Malcolm, the guy learning to mix mortar. But for those who don't yet know, I'm Thomas Malcolm Davis, founder and chairman of Horizon Structures." A shockwave rippled through the crowd, mouths dropped open, eyes widened. And then the applause began. Sporadic, out of sync, not out of habit but out of admiration. Malcolm raised his hand to signal silence. "I have 2 announcements to make. 1. Chief Engineer Brian Whitmore will no longer work at Horizon. 2. From today onward, anyone in this company, whether engineer, bricklayer, security guard, or janitor, has an equal voice regarding safety and fairness. He looked down at the sun-soaked faces. Here at Horizon, we don't just build structures from steel and concrete. We build with respect and integrity. Because the weakest foundation doesn't lie beneath the ground, it lies in how we treat one another. A pause. Then, this time the applause roared. No one started it, but everyone joined in. 6 months later, Horizon Tower now stood complete, tall and bold, against the skyline like an exclamation mark of steel and pride. But the true transformation wasn't in the glass-covered floors above. It was at the bottom where no one expected a quiet rebirth. On the ground floor, a new vocational training center had opened its name Direct Build from Within. It was part of the company's promise after everything that had happened. And each afternoon, in an expansive room filled with drafting boards and foundation models, a once unimaginable scene unfolded. Brian Whitmore, no longer in tailored suits, no more silk ties, no longer carrying that air of superiority, was now teaching a class on lateral load in pile foundations. His face had grown thinner, his hair was longer and no longer meticulously combed. But his eyes, perhaps for the first time in years, were free of defensiveness, no longer trying to prove anything. Just focus, and sometimes a flicker of light. The classroom held 15 students. They came from communities once labeled as technically unqualified former juvenile offenders. Young people without diplomas and those denied access to vocational training simply because they lived in the wrong zip codes. At first, Brian had entered the classroom like a man sentenced to teach. But inside that room, he was finally being listened to, not because of his resume, but because his lessons came from experience. One day, after completing a mock-up of a misaligned foundation, a student raised his hand. "Sir, what if you know the blueprint is wrong, but your boss won't listen? Should you stay silent?" The room fell quiet. Brian swallowed, took a breath. If I could go back in time, I'd listen to a bricklayer. Not because of who he was, but because he was right. Then he turned to the blackboard and wrote in bold white chalk, "Truth, title." Malcolm exited the executive meeting room and walked toward the elevator. He passed the training room on the ground floor and saw Brian packing the day's teaching materials. No words were exchanged at first, but their eyes met. No tension, no hierarchy. "You've decided to stay another term," Malcolm said first. Brian nodded. "I used to think this was punishment. But these kids, they reminded me why I fell in love with engineering in the first place." He glanced at the now finished tower. "They ask questions I never thought to ask. They see things no blueprint ever points out." Malcolm slowly nodded. "Sometimes the very people we once dismissed teach us how to become our best selves." Brian looked down, then quietly said, "No excuses, no defense. I haven't forgotten what I did." Malcolm placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a superior, but as a fellow bricklayer who once carried wet cement good. Because those who forget their mistakes repeat them, but those who remember them can use them to teach others. Monday morning, sunlight streamed through the glass facade of Horizon Tower, shining down onto the lobby like a quiet greeting to a new generation. Something new had been installed on the wall near the main entrance, just beside the reception desk, a golden plaque gleaming in the light. The inscription was simple, unadorned, but powerful enough to make anyone pause and read every word slowly. "We build structures with materials, but we build respect with humility." The one who proposed those words to be etched in metal, of course, was Malcolm Davis. He stood nearby, hands clasped before him, eyes fixed on the plaque. Not because it referenced him, but it reminded everyone why this company had been built in the first place. Build from Within Training Center, 7:45 a.m., Friday. The classroom door had just been opened and the soft golden light of dawn poured in like a quiet blessing. Brian Whitmore had arrived early. He no longer wore a white dress shirt, but a simple grey polo with the sleeves lightly rolled up. In front of him was the technical drafting board, beside it, a wooden foundation model he had assembled himself the night before. The class wasn't complete yet, but one student was already seated in the front row. Jaden Coleman, 17 years old, black slender build, bright eyes, and hands that gripped his mechanical pencil tightly, as if afraid it would slip away if not held with intent. Brian had noticed him since the first week. A quiet kid who didn't speak much, stared at blueprints like listening to a whispering melody hidden in the lines. He walked over. Jaden Bryan said softly, "The roof load drawing you turned in yesterday. Your approach was pretty creative." "Who showed you that?" Jaden looked unsure. "No one, sir. I just figured if the wind hits from the west, the way the columns are anchored should shift to bear the force. I just drew it to try it out." Bryan looked at him. 1 second, 2 seconds, then let out a chuckle, not mocking but a rare laugh from genuine amazement. "You don't know this, but that approach was part of a friend's graduate thesis. And you did it. Even more simply." Jaden looked up, still afraid he might have said something wrong. But Bryan's eyes today carried the light of someone who had just discovered brilliance beneath broken bricks. Malcolm Davis stood silently behind a one-way glass window, watching the class. He didn't step in. He stood there, arms folded, eyes locked on Jaden, who initially reminded him so much of himself. Leonard approached from the hallway. Not going in, Malcolm shook his head and smiled. "Not my class today." "And Bryan? He's teaching the best way possible, by learning all over again, and this time from the very people he once thought were not qualified." Jaden sat alone at a stone bench in the training center courtyard. A sketch was spread out before him, next to 2 small pieces of bread wrapped neatly in paper. Bryan walked over and set down a small carton of orange juice. He said nothing. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Then Jaden asked quietly, "Sir, have you ever built a real building?" Bryan pressed his lips together. His eyes looked into the distance. "Yes, many. Some I once believed were my most significant accomplishments, until one bricklayer showed me that the foundation wasn't sound." Jaden nodded slightly. "I used to think only people in suits got to be heard. But you listened. I'm grateful." Bryan turned to look at him. "No, Jaden. I should be the one thanking you, because you reminded me knowledge doesn't live in a resume. It lives in bright eyes, and the right questions asked at the right time." A light breeze swept through. Above them, the golden plaque in the main lobby glinted again in the morning sun. Saturday evening, the grand hall on the 30th floor of Horizon Tower was aglow with soft, recessed lights bouncing off the glass ceiling like stars across the night sky. All employees, engineers, seasoned laborers, and training center students gathered for the company's 15th anniversary celebration. No ball gowns, no mandatory ties, just simple dress shirts, rolled-up khaki pants, and many hands that had once been covered in cement now clapping for something more profound than salary or title. On stage, there was no professional MC with a mic. Instead, Jaden Coleman, the 17-year-old student with eyes as bright as ever, stood trembling slightly, reading the opening lines, "I never believed I'd get to be an engineer." Until someone laid the first brick of that dream by listening. Applause rang out, not perfectly timed but heartfelt. Then came Malcolm Davis stepping onto the stage. No music, no spotlights, just steady, grounded footsteps, as if even the floor he walked on had been cast from trust. He paused at the podium, surveying the room. His eyes lingered briefly on Bryan, seated in the front row, gently rubbing Jaden's pencil. Malcolm began, 15 years ago, I started Horizon with one simple dream, to build not just with concrete, but with people. What I didn't expect was that I'd have to leave the office, take off my suit, and pick up a trowel again. To find something I had lost, the ability to listen. I used to think the perfect blueprint was all you needed, but I was wrong. A building doesn't collapse from a bad number. It collapses from pride left unchecked. A company doesn't rot because it lacks money. It rots when we stop valuing the voices of those who work under the sun daily. I was once dismissed because I was a black man wearing a laborer's uniform. But that turned out to be the most precious gift, because it showed me who only respects titles, and who truly respects people. Malcolm paused. His gaze sank deeper into the audience. Tonight, I'm not here to deliver a moral lesson. I'm here to hand over a responsibility. The responsibility to protect Horizon's new culture, where any worker can challenge an engineer, where any student can challenge a curriculum, and where every human, regardless of skin color, has the right to be respected. We will go on to build hundreds more towers. But I hope that every brick laid from now on carries a piece of what we've built here through this story: truth, respect, and the belief that humility can hold up even the heaviest concrete. The applause this time lasted long, like an aftershock from the deepest foundation, not loud but steady, certain. Brian stood without a word. He walked over to Jaden and gently squeezed his shoulder. A silent passing of the torch. A man once built with prejudice is now relearning to pass on his craft with empathy. Malcolm stepped off the stage, not back to the office, but out to the west-facing balcony of the tower. Before him, the city glowed with light, and beneath him was the building he had nearly lost control over because of one mocking remark. But he held no bitterness. He smiled, because he understood what truly lasts isn't concrete. It's hearts, rebuilt from the rubble.